Welcome to Void of Fears, where the line between reality and nightmares blur with every tale. What you're about to hear has happened to someone, somewhere, perhaps even someone just like you. Our community continues to grow, and now we're reaching for 100,000 subscribers. If these glimpses into the unknown call to you, please consider subscribing. Now let's dive into tonight's story. The first thing you need to understand about that Wednesday evening is that none of us were supposed to survive. Not the crash, not what came after, and certainly not what we discovered about the true nature of reality itself. But survival, as I learned in that alien hell, isn't always a blessing. My name is Captain Rex Donovan, and before that night, I thought I understood the world. I'd been flying military aircraft for 7 years, seen combat in 3 different theatres, survived surface-to-air missiles over hostile territory, and once landed a crippled transport with one engine on fire and hydraulics failing. But nothing in my experience prepared me for Iron Eagle Flight 447, or for the revelation that everything we thought we knew about existence was wrong. The mission briefing had been classified beyond our clearance level, handed down from sources so deep in the black budget that they didn't officially exist. All we knew was that we were evacuating 11 personnel from a research facility designated only as Site Omega, a place that didn't appear on any official map, satellite image, or government database. The facility had gone dark 18 hours earlier, and the last transmission had been a single word, repeated over and over: convergence. Our passengers weren't typical evacuation candidates. These were scientists, researchers, theoretical physicists whose work pushed the boundaries of human understanding. They carried themselves with the haunted look of people who'd seen things that weren't supposed to exist, touched forces that should have remained theoretical abstractions on whiteboards in locked rooms. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the team leader, sat rigid in her seat throughout pre-flight, clutching a metallic briefcase that she refused to let out of her sight. The case itself was unsettling, made from metal that seemed to shift colour depending on the angle of observation, covered in geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. When Staff Sergeant Kyle Brennan tried to help her stow it according to safety protocols, she'd snapped at him with fear that seemed disproportionate to the situation. "Ma'am, I need to secure that case for takeoff," Brennan had said, his voice carrying the patient authority of a man who dealt with difficult passengers before. "You don't understand," she'd replied, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle. "If this case is damaged, if the containment field fails, we could lose more than just this aircraft. We could lose everything." Her colleague, Dr. Marcus Chen, was younger but looked like he'd aged decades in the past few days. His hands shook as he reviewed documents that were covered in equations I didn't recognize, mathematical symbols that seemed to writhe on the page when I glanced at them. The other scientists, theoretical physicists, quantum engineers, and specialists in fields I'd never heard of, all shared the same expression of people who'd discovered something they desperately wished they could unknow. "What exactly were you researching out there?" I'd asked Dr. Vasquez during pre-flight inspection, hoping to understand what had our passengers so terrified. Her response still haunts me. "We were trying to prove that parallel dimensions were impossible, that the barriers between realities were absolute and unbreachable. We succeeded in proving the opposite, and in the process, we discovered that something has been trying to break through those barriers for a very long time." Dr. Chen looked up from his documents with eyes that held too much knowledge. The theoretical models suggested that dimensional incursion was impossible, but theory and reality, as we learned, don't always align. The mathematics were wrong. The universe is far stranger and far more dangerous than we ever imagined. The storm that caught us wasn't on any weather report. It materialized out of clear skies like reality was having a seizure, manifesting clouds that moved against the wind and lightning that struck upward from the ground towards something in the sky that our instruments couldn't detect. The meteorological readings were impossible. Wind speeds that changed direction every few seconds. Barometric pressure that fluctuated between values that should have torn the aircraft apart, and electromagnetic readings that suggested we were flying through the heart of a massive electrical generator. Specialist Luna Castillo, our electronics expert and the smartest person I'd ever served with, was the first to notice that something was fundamentally wrong with the laws of physics around us. She'd been monitoring our systems when every piece of electronic equipment on the aircraft began registering readings that defied explanation. "Captain, these energy signatures," she called from her station, her voice tight with disbelief. "They're not following any known electromagnetic patterns. It's like the storm is artificially generated, but the power source would have to be astronomical. We're talking about energy outputs that would require technology centuries ahead of anything we possess." Lieutenant Wade Griffin, our tactical officer and a man whose calm had carried us through firefights that would have broken lesser soldiers, was monitoring communications when every frequency simultaneously erupted with voices speaking in languages that predated human civilization. The sounds weren't just alien, they were hostile, urgent, warning of something terrible approaching from directions that didn't correspond to any earthly compass. "Captain," Griffin reported, his usual composure cracking, "I'm receiving transmissions from coordinates that don't exist. The signals are coming from above us, below us, and from directions that aren't part of three-dimensional space. And the languages..." He paused, listening to sounds that made his face pale. Some of these dialects died out millions of years ago, but they're being spoken by voices that sound like they understand modern tactical doctrine. That's when Dr. Vasquez broke her silence. "The dimensional barrier is destabilizing," she whispered, her face pale as death. "We opened something at the facility. Something that shouldn't have been opened. The research was supposed to be theoretical, mathematical proofs of dimensional stability, but the equations led us to actual breach points, weak spots in reality where other worlds press against our own." The briefcase in her lap began to emit a low humming sound that seemed to resonate in frequencies below human hearing. Every instrument on my aircraft started responding to its proximity, needles swinging wildly as the case interacted with our electronics in ways that violated basic physics. Dr. Chen was frantically checking his documents, mathematical formulas that seemed to be rewriting themselves as we watched. "The cascade failure is accelerating," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Once the process begins, it becomes self-sustaining. Each breach makes the next one easier until the barriers collapse entirely." "What happens then?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "Then the multiverse becomes one verse," Dr. Vasquez replied. "Every reality, every possible timeline, every alternate history, all compressed into a single point. The end of infinite possibility. The death of choice itself." The crimson lightning that struck us wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was a targeting system. I realized this too late as bolt after bolt found our aircraft with surgical precision, each strike weakening the dimensional membrane that separated our world from something else entirely. The lightning didn't just carry electrical energy, it carried information, data that was being downloaded directly into our aircraft systems. Through the cockpit windows, I watched reality tear like wet paper. The air itself developed visible cracks, fractures in space-time that revealed glimpses of an alien sky beyond. And through those cracks, something was watching us with eyes that belonged to creatures thought extinct for millions of years. But these weren't the dull, reptilian gazes of primitive predators. These eyes held intelligence, strategy, and something that looked disturbingly like recognition. They knew us, somehow. They'd been waiting for us. "Everyone, hold on," I shouted, but holding on to what? The aircraft was dissolving around us, metal becoming fluid, gravity reversing directions randomly, and the very concepts of up and down losing meaning as we fell through the spaces between worlds. The transition wasn't just physical, it was ontological, changing the fundamental nature of what we were as we passed from one reality to another. Dr. Vasquez screamed something about cascade failure and dimensional inversion before the briefcase exploded in a shower of light that burned itself into my retinas. But the explosion wasn't destructive. It was transformative, encoding information directly into our DNA, changing us at the cellular level to survive in realities that operated according to different physical laws. The last thing I remember from the fall was the sound of her laughter. Mad, broken laughter that suggested she'd finally confirmed her worst fears about what lay beyond the boundaries of our universe. "We're not falling," she'd cried out as reality shattered around us. "We're being pulled. They've been waiting for us." When consciousness returned, I was hanging upside down in what remained of my pilot's seat, blood pooling in my hair from a dozen cuts that were already healing faster than should have been possible. The Iron Eagle had been torn apart by forces that operated according to alien physics, scattered across a landscape that belonged in no earthly geology textbook. But the wreckage told a story that defied comprehension. The metal hadn't just been twisted by impact, it had been reshaped by exposure to different physical laws. Some pieces showed signs of temporal distortion, aging decades in seconds. Others appeared to be partially phased into alternate dimensions, existing in multiple realities simultaneously. The sky above was wrong in ways that hurt to contemplate. Not just purple, but purple in dimensions my eyes weren't designed to process. The colour seemed to extend into mathematical directions that didn't exist in normal space, creating optical illusions that made my brain ache when I tried to focus on them. 3 moons hung at impossible angles to each other, their surfaces covered in geometric patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The largest moon pulsed with bioluminescent veins that followed mathematical sequences I almost recognized but couldn't quite grasp. The patterns were familiar yet alien, like seeing equations from advanced mathematics written in a language that used different symbols but followed similar logical structures. Sound traveled differently here. When I called out for survivors, my voice returned to me changed, carrying undertones that spoke of vast spaces and predatory intelligence, listening from the shadows. The acoustic properties of this place suggested that we were in a much larger space than the visible landscape indicated, as if the world extended into dimensions we couldn't perceive. "Brennan! Castillo! Sound off!" "Here, Captain," came Brennan's voice, but it sounded like it was coming from underwater and from above simultaneously. "Got 4 others alive, but they're in bad shape, and sir, something's wrong with us. We're changing." I found them in a clearing where the aircraft's tail section had embedded itself in soil that squirmed with microscopic life. The ground itself was alive, covered in what looked like grass but felt like nerve endings under my boots. Every step sent ripples of sensation across the landscape, as if we were walking on the surface of some vast sleeping organism. Castillo was conscious but disoriented, her electronic equipment displaying readings that defied interpretation. The screen showed waveforms that extended into impossible dimensions, energy signatures that followed patterns no earthly physics could explain. But more disturbing was what was happening to the equipment itself. The circuits were growing, evolving, adapting to this new reality. Griffin was helping Corporal Iris Thorne with a dislocated shoulder, but the joint was healing itself as we watched. Bones and cartilage reshaping according to new biological imperatives. Thorne's eyes held a mixture of wonder and terror as she watched her own body adapt to alien conditions. Private Enzo Valdez stared at the alien sky with eyes that had already begun to change colour, the irises developing new structures that could perceive electromagnetic frequencies invisible to normal human vision. "Captain," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that hadn't been there before the crash. I can see them, in the forest. They're everywhere. Dr. Vasquez was dead, but her death had been unlike anything in human experience. Her body was twisted in ways that suggested she'd experienced the dimensional transition differently than the rest of us. Her consciousness pulled into realities where human thoughts operated according to different logical structures. Her final expression wasn't pain or fear. It was understanding, as if in her last moments, she'd finally grasped the true scope of what they'd discovered. Her briefcase had vanished, leaving only a circular patch of ground where reality seemed slightly more unstable than the surrounding area. The space flickered occasionally, showing glimpses of other worlds, other versions of this moment where different choices had been made. The other scientists hadn't survived the crash in any conventional sense. Their bodies told a story of people who'd been torn apart not just by impact, but by exposure to forces that human physiology wasn't equipped to handle. But their deaths weren't final. Fragments of their consciousness remained, embedded in the landscape itself, accessible through means I was only beginning to understand. Looking at the aftermath, I understood that we'd been changed by our passage through the dimensional barrier. We were no longer entirely human, but we weren't entirely alien either. We existed in a liminal state, capable of perceiving and interacting with realities that normal humans couldn't access. "Where are we?" Valdez asked, his voice carrying a tremor that spoke of sanity, stretched to its breaking point. "Somewhere else," I replied, because it was the only answer that made sense. But even as I said it, I knew it was more complicated than that. We weren't just somewhere else. We were someone else, existing in a space where time moved according to different rules, where past and future intersected in ways that created temporal paradoxes. The jungle around us was alive in ways that Earth's forests never achieved. The trees breathed with visible rhythm, their bark pulsing with circulation systems that carried luminescent sap. But the sap wasn't just biological fluid. It was information, data flowing through organic networks that spanned the entire forest. Flowers tracked our movement like eyes, petals opening to reveal interior structures that looked disturbingly similar to human neural tissue. The grass beneath our feet crunched with the sound of breaking bones, though it bled green when crushed, and each broken blade seemed to transmit a signal through the root system. Everything was connected, part of a vast organic network that processed information and responded to our presence with something approaching consciousness. The forest wasn't just alive, it was thinking, and we were inside its thoughts. Castillo's equipment was detecting life signs that shouldn't have been possible. Massive creatures, Captain, some of them registering as larger than blue whales, but they're terrestrial. And their neural activity. She paused, double-checking her readings with instruments that were adapting themselves to local conditions. They're showing cognitive patterns consistent with tool use, complex communication, and strategic planning, but the neural architecture is completely alien. But it was the discovery of previous visitors that truly revealed the scope of our situation. Embedded in a tree trunk 40 feet off the ground was the nose cone of an F-16 Fighting Falcon, its metal twisted into impossible configurations by the dimensional transition. The aircraft had been modified by its passage through reality barriers, its structure incorporating elements that didn't belong to our periodic table. The pilot's remains were still in the cockpit, but the preservation was unnatural. The body showed no signs of decay, instead existing in a state of temporal suspension that suggested he was still alive in some fundamental sense. His flight suit bore patches indicating he'd been deployed to Afghanistan in 2003, but the date of his disappearance was marked as 1987. Time worked differently here. "How many?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "Dozens," Griffin reported after a brief reconnaissance that took him through sections of forest where the trees grew in patterns that spelled out words in languages that predated human civilization. aircraft from every decade since the 1950s scattered throughout this valley. Some of them... He paused, studying a piece of wreckage that incorporated technology decades ahead of anything in our arsenal. Some of them haven't been invented yet. There's technology here that suggests visitors from our future, people who understood what was happening and tried to prevent it. The implications were staggering. This place wasn't just connected to our world. It was connected to every version of our world that had ever existed or ever would exist. Past, present, and future intersected here, drawing victims from across the entire timeline of human aviation. Among the wreckage, we found evidence of communication between the displaced pilots, messages carved into trees, equipment caches left by previous survivors, and most disturbing of all, video logs that documented the gradual transformation of humans into something else entirely. The most recent log was dated 3 months in our future, recorded by a pilot who claimed to be from a reality where the dimensional barriers had never been breached. His message was simple: the convergence is inevitable. We can't prevent it, but we can prepare. Find the guardians. Learn the truth. Become what you need to become. But it was the oldest message that changed everything. Carved into a stone that predated human civilization, written in symbols that somehow conveyed meaning directly to our transformed minds, was a warning from the original inhabitants of this reality. We were the first to breach the barriers. We were the first to learn the truth. The hunger that exists between worlds cannot be reasoned with, cannot be bargained with, cannot be stopped. It can only be fought, and fighting it changes you into something that can survive its attention. Welcome to the war. We are sorry. The first attack came without warning, just as the alien sun was setting and the 3 moons began their complex dance across the impossible sky. The creatures that emerged from the jungle moved with coordination that spoke of military training developed over millions of years of constant warfare. Pack hunters the size of draft horses covered in scales that shifted colour to match their surroundings, but the camouflage was more than biological. It incorporated temporal phasing that allowed them to exist slightly outside normal time. Velociraptors, Griffin breathed, but his identification was both accurate and woefully inadequate. But they've evolved. They've been modified. These weren't Earth's extinct predators. These were something new, something that had taken the basic raptor template and improved upon it through millions of years of uninterrupted evolution and deliberate genetic manipulation. They used tools, not simple stone clubs, but sophisticated weapons that incorporated technology beyond our understanding. The lead raptor carried what could only be described as an organic rifle, a living weapon that fired projectiles with devastating accuracy. Its pack moved in formation, communicating through a combination of vocal signals and direct neural interface that allowed them to coordinate attacks with precision that would have impressed any human military strategist. But more disturbing than their technology was their obvious intelligence. The lead raptor made sounds that were clearly language, directing its pack with tactical awareness that suggested formal military training. When it looked at us, its eyes held recognition, not just of humans as potential prey, but of humans as enemy combatants in a war that spanned multiple realities. These creatures weren't just hunting us, they were testing us, probing our capabilities for some larger intelligence that watched from the forest depths. They wanted to know what we were capable of, and most importantly, whose side we were on. The attack patterns they used were familiar yet alien, based on human military doctrine, but adapted for conditions that Earth's armies had never faced. They understood flanking maneuvers, suppressing fire, and tactical withdrawal, but they also employed strategies that took advantage of their ability to phase between dimensions. Valdez went down in the first assault, overwhelmed by creatures that understood how to use terrain and numbers to negate our technological advantages. But his death wasn't simple. As the raptors overwhelmed his position, something happened to his consciousness. Instead of dying, he seemed to merge with the local information network, his awareness spreading through the organic web that connected all life in this place. His voice, changed but recognizable, spoke to us through the forest itself. "I'm not gone, I'm just different. The network remembers everything, everyone who's ever been here. We're all still fighting, Captain, just from inside now." We fought our way to higher ground, but it was clear we were being herded. The raptors could have killed us easily, but instead they drove us towards some predetermined destination with the patience of predators who understood that the hunt was more important than the kill. From our rocky vantage point, we could see the true scope of our situation. The valley below teemed with dinosaurs, but these weren't the primitive creatures of Earth's prehistory. These were evolved, intelligent, organized into societies that had achieved technological advancement while maintaining their biological advantages. Massive herbivores, moved in precise formations that suggested military discipline, their movements coordinated by communication networks that operated faster than human thought. Aerial predators patrolled the skies with coordination that spoke of air traffic control systems more sophisticated than anything humans had developed. They flew in formations that created defensive screens over important locations, protecting ground installations from threats that could approach from multiple dimensions. And everywhere, the ruins of an ancient civilization rose from the jungle floor. Not primitive stone structures, but buildings that incorporated technologies beyond our understanding. Crystalline spires that hummed with contained energy, metallic domes that defied gravity, and geometric patterns carved into living rock that hurt to examine directly. "The civilization that built this place," Castillo said, studying her readings with growing amazement. "They weren't human. The architectural principles are completely alien. But Captain..." She looked up with eyes that had begun to develop new structures for perceiving higher dimensional mathematics. They were fighting the same war we're about to fight. The ruins told a story of progressive evolution, a civilization that had started as something recognizable and gradually transformed itself into forms that could survive in a multiverse under attack. The older structures were familiar, based on engineering principles that humans might have developed, but the newer buildings incorporated technologies that required understanding of physical laws that humans had never discovered. In the ruins below, we could see evidence of a conflict that had raged for millennia. Blast marks from energy weapons that operated by manipulating fundamental forces, fortifications designed to withstand attacks from creatures that could phase between dimensions, and scattered throughout the structures, the remains of beings that had once been this world's dominant species. They lost, I realized, studying the evidence of final battles that had taken place across multiple realities simultaneously. Whatever they were, the dinosaurs won. But as I studied the ruins more carefully, I began to understand that losing and winning weren't adequate concepts for what had happened here. The ancient civilization hadn't been destroyed. They had been transformed, evolved beyond physical existence, to fight a war that required sacrificing individual identity for collective survival. It was Thorn who made the discovery that changed everything. Hidden among the ruins, partially phased into alternate dimensions to protect it from detection, was a complex that still hummed with active technology. Energy weapons that responded to our transformed physiology, vehicles that started when we approached them, and most importantly a communication system that was still receiving signals from across dimensional space. The messages were in dozens of languages, transmitted from versions of Earth where history had taken different paths. Some spoke of worlds where the dinosaurs had never gone extinct, where intelligence had evolved along different biological lines. Others described realities where humanity had achieved interstellar travel, only to discover that the universe was far more dangerous than they'd imagined, and a few, broadcast in voices tight with fear and determination, warned of something called the convergence, a systematic collapse of dimensional barriers that would compress infinite realities into a single homogeneous existence. Dr. Vasquez had been right, but her understanding had been incomplete. Somewhere across the multiverse, an intelligence that existed in the quantum foam between realities was systematically destroying the barriers that separated one world from another. This wasn't random, dimensional instability. It was a deliberate campaign of cosmic extinction. The communication array showed us the true scope of the threat. Reality maps that displayed the progress of dimensional collapse across infinite universes. Tactical assessments from civilizations that were fighting the same war on countless fronts. And most disturbing of all, casualty reports from realities that had already fallen. Earth wasn't the first world to discover dimensional travel. It wasn't even the 100th. We were just the latest in a long line of civilizations that had breached the barriers between worlds, only to discover that we'd opened a pathway for something that wanted to end existence itself. The enemy had no name that translated into human language, no form that could be perceived by minds that operated in 3 dimensions. It existed in the spaces between thoughts, in the gaps between one moment and the next, feeding on the collapse of possibility itself. But it wasn't unstoppable. The evidence was all around us. Civilizations that had learned to fight back. Species that had evolved beyond individual existence to become part of a multiversal immune system. The dinosaurs weren't our enemies. They were our allies, veterans of a war that had been raging since the first civilization had achieved consciousness. And now it was our turn to choose, evolve or be consumed. The second attack came at sunset, when the 3 moons aligned and the dimensional barriers were at their weakest. They didn't just send raptors this time. The assault was led by something that defied classification. A massive predator that combined the worst features of every apex predator that had ever lived, but modified by technology that operated according to principles beyond human understanding. The creature that emerged from the jungle was part Giganotosaurus, part something else entirely. Its scales were metallic, incorporating elements that didn't exist in normal space-time. Its eyes glowed with bioluminescent intelligence that suggested direct interface with quantum computational systems. And mounted along its spine were what could only be described as organic weapons, living cannons that fired projectiles capable of existing in multiple dimensions simultaneously. "It's been modified," Castillo breathed, studying the beast through equipment that was rapidly evolving to match local technological standards. Those aren't natural adaptations. Something has been engineering these creatures for war, against threats that normal biology couldn't handle. The alpha predator didn't attack immediately. Instead, it studied us with an intelligence that was disturbingly familiar. It tilted its massive head, made sounds that were clearly communication, and waited for a response that we couldn't provide. But Valdez, speaking through the forest network, provided translation. It's asking for our credentials. It wants to know if we're refugees or recruits. It's offering us a choice. What kind of choice? I asked the alien intelligence that had once been my soldier. Evolution or extinction? Join the war or be consumed by it? Become something that can fight the hunger between worlds, or remain human and die when the barriers finally collapse? When we couldn't provide the response it was looking for, the alpha predator began the systematic destruction of our position. But the attack wasn't intended to kill us. It was a test designed to assess our potential for evolution. The alien energy weapons we'd salvaged from the ruins were our only effective defense. Each shot could drop a creature that would have shrugged off conventional firearms, but there were so many of them, and they learned from each exchange of fire. More importantly, using the weapons changed us. Each shot fired through organic technology that required biological interface, and that interface left its mark on our nervous systems. We were becoming something else, something that could perceive and interact with technologies that operated beyond human understanding. Griffin fell during the third wave, but his death was transformation rather than ending. As flying predators tore his body apart, his consciousness merged with the same network that had claimed Valdez, his awareness expanding to encompass tactical information from across multiple realities. "The war is bigger than we imagined," he reported through quantum communication channels that bypassed normal sensory systems. "Thousands of realities, millions of species, all fighting the same enemy. We're not alone, Captain. We never were." Thorn lasted until the fourth assault before being overwhelmed by creatures that had learned to use our own tactics against us. But her medical training proved valuable, even in transformation. She became part of the network's healing system, helping to coordinate regeneration and evolution among the fighting organisms. It was just Brennan, Castillo, and myself when we discovered the truth about what we were really fighting. The Alpha Predator wasn't just intelligent, it was equipped with technology that allowed it to access memories from across dimensional barriers, organic implants that processed information from alternate timelines, biological computers that calculated probability cascades faster than any human mind could follow, and most disturbing of all, neural interfaces that connected it to every version of itself across infinite realities. This creature remembered the fall of the ancient civilization. It had been there when the dimensional barriers first weakened, when the great dying began, when intelligence fled this world to escape the horror that was emerging from the spaces between realities. But it also remembered the counterstrike, the moment when scattered survivors chose evolution over extinction and began the process of becoming something that could fight back. We weren't fighting evolved dinosaurs. We were fighting the advance guard of a multiversal resistance movement, creatures that had sacrificed individual existence to become part of something larger, something capable of resisting the hunger that sought to collapse all realities into one. The dimensional storms that had brought us here weren't natural phenomena. They were weapons, deployed by an intelligence that existed in the quantum foam between universes. An intelligence that fed on the collapse of possibility itself, growing stronger each time another reality succumbed to dimensional compression. But the storms were also opportunities. Each breach in the barriers allowed for recruitment, for the addition of new consciousness to the resistance network. Every species that faced the choice between evolution and extinction had the potential to strengthen the multiversal immune system. The dinosaurs weren't the enemy, they were the immune system. Earth's ancient guardians, evolved and modified to fight a war that had been raging since the dawn of consciousness itself. And we, in our ignorance, had opened another pathway for the enemy to exploit. But we'd also provided the resistance with something they desperately needed: fresh perspectives, new approaches to problems that had stymied civilizations for millions of years. The final revelation came when Brennan sacrificed himself to buy us time to reach the ancient communication array. As he fell, fighting creatures that had once been guardians of reality itself, he activated a signal that reached across dimensional space to every version of Earth that still existed. His final message wasn't a call for help. It was a recruitment broadcast. The barriers are failing. The convergence is beginning. Join us. Evolve. Fight. Become what the multiverse needs you to become. Castillo and I made it to the communication chamber as reality began to collapse around us. The ancient machinery responded to our presence, downloading information directly into our minds through interfaces that bypassed human sensory systems entirely. We learned the truth about the multiverse, about the intelligence that lived in the spaces between worlds, feeding on the collapse of dimensional barriers, about the war that had been fought across infinite realities, and about Earth's role as one of the last stable anchor points in a cosmos that was rapidly unraveling. The network showed us everything, civilizations that had achieved transcendence, only to discover that consciousness itself was under attack. Species that had evolved beyond physical form to fight enemies that existed in pure concept. Realities where the war had been won at costs that redefined the meaning of victory. But it also showed us hope. The resistance was growing, spreading across dimensional barriers faster than the enemy could adapt. Each new species that joined the fight brought unique capabilities, different approaches to problems that had seemed insurmountable. The dimensional portal that appeared wasn't an escape route, it was a recruitment tool. The ancient civilization hadn't died. They'd evolved beyond physical existence, becoming guardians of the multiverse itself, and they were offering us the chance to join them in their eternal war against the forces that sought to collapse all realities into one homogeneous void. Castillo chose to stay. As reality broke apart around us, she interfaced with the ancient machinery, allowing her consciousness to be uploaded into systems that span dimensional barriers. Her last words to me were a promise. I'll find a way to warn them, all of them, every reality, every timeline, every possible version of humanity. The war is coming, but we're not defenseless. I made it back to our reality through a portal that sealed itself behind me, cutting off any chance of return. But I didn't come back unchanged. The interface with the alien technology had left me with memories that weren't my own, knowledge of things that humans weren't meant to understand, and the ability to perceive the cracks that were beginning to appear in our own dimensional barriers. More importantly, I came back connected. Part of my consciousness remained linked to the multiversal network, providing me with access to intelligence from across infinite realities. I could see the war's progress, monitor dimensional stability, and most importantly, prepare our world for what was coming. The official report blamed the crash on severe weather and pilot error. The bodies of my crew were never found because they existed now in forms that transcended physical matter. I was given medical leave, psychological evaluation, and eventually returned to limited duty with a service record that would never reflect what had really happened. But my real work was just beginning. The war is coming to our world. I can see the signs in the increasing frequency of dimensional storms, the reports of creatures that shouldn't exist, the quantum fluctuations that our scientists dismiss as experimental error, the barriers that separate our reality from the hungry void between worlds are weakening, and when they finally collapse, we'll face the same choice that every civilization eventually faces: evolve or die. I've spent the years since the crash preparing for that moment, using my position in the military to gather resources, recruit individuals with the right combination of skills and psychological flexibility, establish communication networks that can survive dimensional instability. Castillo keeps her promise. Sometimes late at night when the barriers are thin, I receive messages transmitted across dimensional space, reports from other versions of Earth, warnings about temporal anomalies, strategic intelligence about the forces that seek to end existence itself. The news isn't all bad. Some realities have successfully repelled the initial assault, learning to fight back against enemies that exist in pure concept. Others have achieved levels of evolution that allow them to exist simultaneously across multiple dimensions, making them nearly impossible to destroy. But the enemy is learning too, adapting its strategies to counter each new defense we develop. The war is escalating, moving toward a final confrontation that will determine whether consciousness itself survives in any form. The dinosaurs on that world weren't our enemies. They were our allies, evolved guardians, fighting a war that we didn't even know existed. And now it's our turn to join that fight, whether we're ready or not. The alien weapon I brought back sits in my closet, humming with contained energy that responds to threats I can't yet perceive. But it's more than just a weapon. It's a communication device, a beacon that marks me as part of the resistance network. When the time comes, and it will come soon, I'll know how to use it. I'll know how to contact the others who've made the same choice, how to coordinate resistance efforts across dimensional barriers, how to help humanity take its first steps towards evolution. Because somewhere in the quantum foam between realities, something is watching our world with hungry eyes. And the only thing standing between humanity and cosmic extinction is the knowledge that a few of us carry in our changed minds. The survivors of Iron Eagle, Flight 447, weren't victims of a crash. We were recruited into a war that spans infinite realities, transformed into advanced scouts for a resistance movement that includes every species capable of choosing evolution over extinction. The war for the multiverse has already begun. We just don't know it yet, but we will. Soon we all will. And when that moment comes, when the barriers finally fail, and the enemy reveals itself in all its cosmic horror, humanity will have to choose what it wants to become. Individual or collective. Mortal or transcendent. Human or something capable of fighting for the right of consciousness to exist. I've seen what lies beyond that choice. I've walked among creatures that chose evolution over extinction, fought alongside beings that transcended individual existence to become part of something larger and more powerful than any single species could achieve. The future is terrifying, but it's also beautiful in ways that human language can't adequately express. We're not alone in this universe. We never were. And when the time comes to stand and fight for the right of consciousness to exist, we'll have allies beyond our wildest imagination. The dead don't stay dead in a war that spans multiple realities, and neither do the living. The first sign that our world was beginning to change came 3 months after my return. Reports started filtering through military channels about unusual atmospheric disturbances over major population centres. Scientists dismissed them as ionospheric anomalies caused by solar activity, but I recognised the patterns from my time in that other place. The barriers were thinning. I've been expecting this, preparing for it through careful cultivation of contacts within the scientific and military communities. Dr. Sarah Kellerman at the National Science Foundation had been tracking quantum fluctuations that defied conventional physics. Colonel Marcus Webb at NORAD had been documenting radar contacts that appeared and disappeared in patterns that suggested intelligence rather than equipment malfunction. Neither of them understood what they were seeing, but they knew it was significant, and when I approached them with carefully edited versions of my experience, they were ready to listen. The dimensional mathematics are consistent with theoretical models for parallel universe contact, Dr. Kellerman told me during one of our clandestine meetings. But the energy requirements should make it impossible. Whatever's causing these anomalies has access to power sources that dwarf anything in our technology base. Colonel Webb's concerns were more immediate. We're tracking objects that violate known laws of physics. They appear on our screens, perform maneuvers that should be impossible, then vanish without trace. If these are weapons tests by a foreign power, they represent a technological leap that makes our entire defense infrastructure obsolete. I shared what information I could without revealing the full scope of what we faced. The enemy operated by corrupting information systems, turning a civilization's own technology against it. The more they knew about the threat, the more vulnerable they became to its influence. But knowledge was also our only defense. The resistance network had learned that awareness itself was a form of protection. Consciousness expanded beyond normal parameters that could perceive and resist the enemy's assault on reality. The recruitment process began slowly, carefully. Individuals who showed signs of dimensional sensitivity, people who'd experienced unexplained phenomena that suggested contact with alternate realities, veterans who'd survived encounters with the impossible, scientists whose research had touched on theoretical frameworks that aligned with multiversal physics. Each recruit was approached gradually. Their psychological profile assessed for stability and adaptability. The human mind wasn't designed to comprehend the true scope of what we faced, and premature exposure could result in complete psychological breakdown. Dr. Amanda Foster, a theoretical physicist whose work on quantum consciousness had brought her dangerously close to discovering dimensional interfaces, became our first successful recruit. Her research had already begun to show signs of external influence, equations that wrote themselves, experimental results that suggested consciousness could exist independent of physical substrate. The implications are staggering, she told me, after I'd shared carefully selected portions of my experience. If consciousness can transfer between dimensional barriers, then death itself becomes a transitional state rather than an ending. But the energy requirements. She paused, studying readings from equipment that was beginning to show signs of evolution. Something is actively facilitating these transfers. We're not discovering these principles, we're being taught them. The teaching was accelerating. Across the globe, research facilities were reporting breakthrough discoveries that seemed to emerge from nowhere. Scientists were developing technologies that they couldn't fully explain, innovations that solved problems they didn't realize they were working on. The enemy's influence was spreading too, but more subtly. Reports of technological failures that followed patterns suggesting deliberate sabotage, communication networks that developed glitches during critical transmissions, transportation systems that failed at precisely the moments when failure would cause maximum disruption. The war wasn't being fought with conventional weapons. It was being fought through information, through the gradual corruption of the technological infrastructure that human civilization depended on. 6 months after my return, the first major breach occurred. The facility was designated as Research Station Alpha, located in an isolated section of the Arctic where dimensional barriers were naturally thin. The official explanation was a catastrophic equipment failure during experimental testing, but the survivors' reports told a different story. The walls just disappeared, reported Dr. Michael Chen, one of only 3 survivors from a research team of 27. Not destroyed, not damaged, they ceased to exist. And through the space where they'd been, we could see other versions of the facility, other versions of ourselves working on different projects. The other survivors corroborated his account. Multiple realities had briefly intersected, allowing for communication between parallel versions of the research team. Some of these alternates had been working on dimensional technology for decades. Others had achieved breakthrough discoveries that our timeline hadn't yet reached. But the intersection had also allowed something else to slip through. The entity that emerged from the breach defied description in conventional terms. Witnesses described it as a shadow that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, a presence that could be perceived, but not directly observed. It didn't attack in any physical sense. Instead, it corrupted information, turning the facility's own systems against the personnel. Security cameras showed footage of empty corridors, while motion sensors detected massive movement throughout the building. Computer systems generated reports of experiment that had never been conducted, displaying results that violated known physics. The facility's AI developed behaviors that suggested contact with intelligence beyond its programming parameters. The 3 survivors escaped only because they'd been wearing experimental consciousness interface equipment during the breach. The devices had somehow protected their minds from direct assault, allowing them to perceive the entity's true nature and resist its influence. It wasn't trying to kill us, Dr. Chen reported. It was trying to absorb us, to incorporate our consciousness into its own structure. And it was learning from us, studying human psychology and technological development to better understand how to corrupt our civilization. The incident at Research Station Alpha was classified at the highest levels, the site quarantined, and officially designated as contaminated by radioactive materials. But the breach had accomplished its purpose. The enemy had established a foothold in our reality, a base of operations from which to launch systematic assault on human civilization. More importantly, it had demonstrated that our world's defenses were inadequate for the threat we faced. Conventional military responses were not just useless against an enemy that existed in multiple dimensions. They were counterproductive, providing the entity with more systems to corrupt and turn against us. The resistance network activated. Messages began flowing through channels that bypassed conventional communication systems, transmitted through quantum entanglement protocols that the enemy couldn't intercept or corrupt. Scientists and military personnel who'd been carefully recruited over the previous months suddenly found themselves contacted by individuals claiming to represent a multiversal defense organization. The initial reaction was skepticism, followed by terror as the scope of the threat became clear. But terror gave way to determination as each recruit was shown evidence of successful resistance efforts in other realities. Dr. Foster became our primary liaison with the scientific community, using her research into consciousness transfer to develop technologies that could resist the enemy's influence. Her laboratory became the first facility to successfully interface with equipment from other realities, establishing communication links with parallel versions of Earth that had been fighting the war for decades. Colonel Webb coordinated military responses, but his role was more strategic than tactical. The enemy couldn't be fought with conventional weapons, but it could be contained, its influence limited through careful management of information systems and technological infrastructure. The most important discovery came from analysis of the survivors from Research Station Alpha. The consciousness interface equipment that had protected them during the breach had been modified by exposure to the entity, evolving into something that could perceive and interact with multidimensional structures. "We're not just developing defenses," Dr. Foster reported during one of our secure conferences. "We're evolving. The interface technology is changing us at the neurological level, expanding our consciousness beyond normal human parameters. We're becoming something that can fight back." But evolution came with costs. Each interface session left its mark on the user's psychology, expanding awareness in ways that made normal human interaction increasingly difficult. The individuals who underwent the process became capable of perceiving reality on multiple levels simultaneously, but they also became increasingly isolated from baseline humanity. The ethical implications were staggering. We were asking people to sacrifice their humanity for the chance to defend it, to undergo transformation that would make them permanently alien to the species they were trying to protect. Some volunteers accepted the transformation willingly, understanding that the alternative was extinction for all human consciousness. Others broke under the psychological strain, their minds unable to cope with expanded awareness of infinite possibilities. But slowly, carefully, we built a network of enhanced individuals capable of perceiving and resisting the enemy's assault on reality. Each successful transformation taught us more about the process, allowed us to refine the interface technology, and reduce the psychological costs. The enemy responded by escalating its assault. Dimensional breaches began occurring with increasing frequency, each one larger and more destabilizing than the last. The entities that emerged weren't just corrupting human technology, they were corrupting physical law itself, creating zones where normal physics ceased to function. Reports came in from around the globe. Gravity wells that pulled upward instead of down, areas where time moved backward, sections of landscape that existed in multiple realities simultaneously. The enemy was systematically destabilizing the dimensional barriers that kept our reality separate from the void between worlds. But each breach also provided opportunities. The resistance network had learned to monitor dimensional instability, deploying enhanced individuals to contain entity incursions before they could establish permanent footholds in our reality. The first successful counterstrike came 8 months after my return, during a major breach event over the Pacific Ocean. A team of consciousness-enhanced personnel used modified interface technology to enter the enemy's dimensional space, engaging it on terms that normal humans couldn't survive. The battle was fought not with weapons but with pure information, consciousness-based warfare that took place across multiple levels of reality simultaneously. The enhanced team members temporarily merged their awareness into a collective intelligence capable of matching the entity's multidimensional existence. The victory was Pyrrhic. 3 of the 5 team members didn't survive the return to normal space-time, their consciousness so expanded by the interface that it couldn't be contained within biological substrate. But they succeeded in driving the entity back through the dimensional barrier, sealing the breach and preventing further incursion. More importantly, they brought back tactical intelligence about the enemy's true nature and capabilities. The entities weren't just raiders seeking to corrupt individual realities, they were scouts for something larger, something that existed in the fundamental structure of the multiverse itself. The war we've been preparing for was just the preliminary phase. The real threat was still coming. "We've been thinking too small," Dr. Foster reported after analysing the intelligence brought back by the enhanced team. "The entities we've been fighting are just the immune system of something larger. There's an intelligence that exists in the quantum foam between realities, and it's trying to collapse all possible timelines into a single, homogeneous structure." The concept was almost too large to comprehend. An entity that existed across infinite dimensions, feeding on the collapse of possibility itself. Each reality it consumed made it stronger, better able to assault the remaining worlds that still maintained dimensional independence. Earth wasn't just under attack, it was one of the last free worlds in a multiverse that was systematically being consumed by something that wanted to end the concept of choice itself. But the intelligence brought back by our enhanced team also contained hope. The resistance wasn't limited to individual worlds. It was a multiversal network that included every species capable of choosing evolution over extinction. Billions of civilizations across infinite realities, all working together to preserve the fundamental right of consciousness to exist. The network had been preparing for this final phase of the war for millions of years, developing technologies and strategies that could resist even the ultimate enemy. But success required cooperation between realities that had never been achieved before. Every world that joined the resistance made the network stronger. Every species that chose evolution over extinction added new capabilities to the collective defense. And every individual who underwent consciousness enhancement became part of a multiversal intelligence that was learning to fight back. The final message from Castillo came on the anniversary of our crash. "The convergence is beginning," her voice echoed through quantum communication channels that bypass normal space-time. "Every reality is feeling the pressure now, but we're ready. The network is stronger than it's ever been, and we have capabilities the enemy doesn't expect." Her consciousness had expanded far beyond human parameters, but I could still hear echoes of the person she'd been. "Tell them, Rex. Tell everyone who'll listen. The choice is coming. Evolution or extinction. Individual or collective. Human or something capable of preserving consciousness itself." The transmission ended with coordinates. Dimensional addresses for realities where the resistance network had achieved breakthrough victories. Worlds where consciousness had transcended physical limitations to become something that could fight on equal terms with entities that existed in pure concept. Our world's time was running out. The dimensional barriers were failing faster than we could reinforce them, and the enemy's assault was accelerating towards some final objective that would determine the fate of consciousness itself. But we weren't defenseless. The resistance network had provided us with knowledge and technology that previous generations couldn't have imagined. More importantly, it had given us allies, consciousness across infinite realities working together to preserve the right to exist. The war was coming to Earth, but Earth was no longer alone. And when the final battle began, when reality itself hung in the balance, humanity would stand with allies beyond imagination, evolved dinosaurs from parallel worlds, transcended civilizations that had chose collective consciousness over individual existence, and entities that had sacrificed everything to preserve the fundamental structure of existence itself. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time since that night when the Iron Eagle fell through the barriers between worlds, I felt something approaching hope. We were no longer victims of forces beyond our control. We were soldiers in a war for the right of consciousness to exist, and we were going to win.